Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Moral Panic with Christian and Nikoji. Thank you guys so much for being here. As always, I appreciate all of you being here to engage in some good thinking with us, to engage in the issues of the day, and to hopefully bring a first principles based and rigorous perspective to addressing them. And so we have some very interesting topics lined up today. There's been a lot of things going on in the public discourse over the past, I would say, week or so. And one of the biggest stories, as the title of this video says, is the North Carolina woman, a Ukrainian refugee coming to America while being on a train getting stabbed by a repeat offender. This has caused a lot of different speculations and debates on social media. It's caused, I think, a rather fierce debate over race and the race of certain offenders in this country doing certain kinds of crimes. Has caused a lot of debate over the criminal justice system and how it treats certain types of offenders. And it's also, I think, triggered a kind of tribal ethno reaction in the hearts of some people, and it's also triggered a much more revolutionary tendency in the minds of others. So we're going to be able to parse through that. We'll be discussing, which is kind of resonant with our topic, but it's not really in the same category, the topic of militias and how militias, the nature of militias, and how militias play a role in sort of social dynamic around certain areas of politics in our society. And of course, we'll be talking about other things that many of you may wish for us to talk about. Again, please feel free to give suggestions in the comments or to chime in as you will. Before we get started, as I always start by doing, Nico J, how are you doing, my friend?
Hello. Yeah, I'm doing fine. I think we have a good layout of different topics. All of them, even if the militias are maybe not in the news cycle currently, they have been in the past, and they're still a topic that, if you were to look at the intelligence state or the deep state, it's a topic that concerns them. So if it's a topic that concerns them, perhaps we should dig into it as well. And there's a variety of other news stories, some of which we're just getting latest developments about. So we'll see where the topics goes. As always, you could leave your comments, questions, and further topics in the chat.
Excellent. So without further ado, if you want to, as you normally want to do, why don't you take us into our first topic, whatever that might be?
Sure. So the North Carolina stabbing by a repeat offender. I don't have the exact article up, but it's been in the news for a couple days now. And why don't we go ahead and just bring it up, just because we're going to just highlight it for those who have not heard about it. It seems like the average viewer has heard about it, but just for clarity's sake, bear with us for a moment, unless you have it.
No.
That's fine. That's all.
I should have been more prepared.
Yeah, no worries. So this was a brutal stabbing on a North Carolina subway. And it's interesting because it involved also a refugee. The Ukraine stuff itself is in the news, but for this to be in crime news, it adds a interesting layer in development of American crime. So they showed that this passenger was on a subway cart on Friday. The American refugee was identified as Irina Zarkusta, and she was stabbed multiple times by a homeless man. So, a lot of topics already, when we think of crime, when we think of mental institutions, and there are many who would say bring back the asylums, and there are many who would say it in an almost different way. They'll say support our institutions, which is, maybe the end result is the same. But I want to know your take on, crime and mental illness. It's such a recurring topic when we look at the videos you've done in the past. It's such a recurring topic for even conservatives. It's become a talking point that, this is mental illness. But if you were to ask a leftist on this issue, they would also talk about mental illness as well. So on both sides, it seems to be a recurring topic.
Yeah.
What are your takes on that?
Totally. And I think both respective perspectives, I might lose a little bit of alliteration there, around the issue of crime also reflect a certain view of human nature that is roughly modeled around the same notions on both sides, at least the same notions that each camp holds. On the more leftward leaning views of human nature is that Man is inherently a good being and was inherently an unformed being, and he can be formed and shaped by institutions of power. And institutions of power play a big role, not just in his moral formation, but in his ability to express the height of his freedom in society. This is why you see in the idea of positive rights, which is an idea that's been promoted by the United Nations and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is just a idea of positive rights dressed up in a little bit more of obscure language. You have freedom being the result of provision, not rather than freedom being the result of enlightenment. So freedom comes from without with the positive rights theory, whereas real freedom comes from within. After you've gone through a process of refinement and alignment, you refine yourself enough to be able to understand what kind of conduct is good and right, and then you align that conduct with the principles needed. And at the end of that process, freedom comes. Whereas on the left, freedom comes at the end of a process of manufacturing the kind of world that is better for people in their view, and then can result in more material flourish. On the right, there generally, and these are very broad strokes, there are variations, but there generally appears to be an idea that human nature is set in stone. There are things about human nature. There's a perspective about the quality of human nature. Some people believe that it is inherently good, that it is flawed but not evil. Others on the right believe that it is evil beyond repair and therefore needs authority to hold it down. This is the more Hobbesian view, which is not as popular on the American right as some may wish it to be, but it is gaining popularity in a new form. And so you have these two conflicting perspectives. And since crime is simply human behavior, your view on human nature will impact how you view crime and also how you view solutions to crime. The individual who happened to murder this innocent Ukrainian immigrant, or rather not immigrant, migrant, refugee, I should probably say, was a repeat offender, as we know from the empirical record. Not only was he a repeat offender, but he is obviously someone who has been given breaks by the system for reasons that we can only speculate. But a reasonable person in this day and age, where a lot of the policies in our justice system are set with an eye towards distributing privileges and resources to certain groups to correct quote-unquote disparities, we can assume that the leniency shown towards him and his repeated history of violent offense has to do with some measure of quote-unquote equity or some measure of, more broadly, distributive justice, which is frankly a counterfeit version of justice. It is rather injustice, because justice is concerned with protecting the persons and the properties and the promises and the covenants and contracts of people in society. It's also concerned with, on a second level, that's the first level of justice, which is its immediate impact. The second level is concerned with cultivating a character within us that will get us towards good conduct. But justice has been reinterpreted to mean rather giving things to people who don't have certain things, and then by doing that, correcting some problem that they must have had in the past by virtue of their existence, whether it be their skin color, whether it be their religion, whether it be their race, whatever. It's all the same beast in terms of the phenomenon. So we can assume that this person in this climate of equity and this climate of distributed justice was given breaks for that very reason. And we unfortunately have seen the bloody cost of that line of thinking. Very simply, there are some people. I mentioned conscience a lot in my videos. I mentioned rightful conduct a lot in my videos, and even in this monologue here, I've mentioned it a few times. There are some people whose minds are so distorted that they are not able to follow a path of rightful conduct. They're not able to have a well-ordered conscience, and in that event, a different procedure is necessitated to deal with them. There's general humanity. There's how most of us should function, how we do function. We think, we feel, we reflect, we react, and these things harmonize. And then there's monstrous humanity, where the brain does not work how it should. And in not working how it should, actions are disordered, and actions go towards the destruction of other people or yourself, or both. This is what happens when you have, for example, someone who has extremely high levels of certain mental illnesses. This is what happens when you have sociopathy. Sociopathy is one of the most virulent and most dangerous forms of monstrous humanity, because sociopaths don't always show their color. In fact, most of them are smart enough not to show their colors. Sociopaths know how to behave, know how to manipulate, know how to deceive, know how to subjugate people to their whims, while with a smile on their face, and most people would never suggest, which is why politics is actually a very high field for the sociopaths. Then you got people who just plainly have tendencies to violence that are unchecked by conscience, whose minds are worn down either by years of drug use or alcohol abuse or whatever, who end up going in to do destructive things. That's what we have here. I believe that's what we have here. Now, we don't know exactly what the mental state of this guy was beyond a general appraisal. But what we seem to have here is someone whose monstrous humanity was not corrected or was not punished and kept back by the justice system, but was instead aided by philosophies that are supposed to be benevolent, that supposedly help those who have less and who are misfortunate. We have to begin to abandon these deluded notions of justice in our society that are simply harming rather than helping, and not only that, but they're allowing injustice to flourish. So I view this issue particularly within the prism of that moral problem, the problem of an artificial, untrue version of justice, which focuses on distribution rather than one that focuses on preservation, cultivation, and refinement. And so this is a moral problem at the bottom. Some people are trying to make this a racial problem. I don't think that's true, because I can pick out any incident in many major cities, take DC, for example, of homeless people who are not black or of different colors behaving violently towards people, hitting teachers with bats and stuff like that, trying to kill people. Unfortunately, there is a certain kind of humanity which puts one in the posture where that kind of behavior is not just expected, but it unfortunately is inevitable. So we have to be very careful when we assess the quality of certain situations. We have to be careful not to engage in category errors, not to mischaracterize things. We have to be careful not to treat a moral problem as a race problem, or a race problem as a problem of the heart, a problem of the heart as a problem of tribe. These things are different, and we are betrayed. A sound solution to the problems of society is betrayed by an unwillingness to look at things as they are rather than things as we wish them to be. So my heart goes out to the girl's family. No one should have to die like this. I myself have become quite skeptical of public transportation over the years. I've become quite skeptical of these kind of transitory spaces, because we actually saw something very similar happen in Canada. I think a guy was on a Greyhound bus, and a homeless Chinese man, like, looked at him and just killed him, like, while he was sleeping, cut his throat.
Wow.
Yeah, this monstrous humanity has to be addressed in a way that is forceful, in a way that is honest, in a way that gives no quarter to sensitivity. The reason monstrous humanity, as I've termed it, is not addressed a lot is very simply, again, this false idea of moral excellence that comes from an incorrect idea of justice, and most importantly, sensitivity, oversensitivity. People think when we address monstrous humanity, we're singling out people that have mental health problems. We're not doing that, because not all mental health problems are made equal. Many people with mental health problems never go out and hurt anybody. But we are singling out a category of people that have a certain manifestation of problems that is ruinous to all of us in society. Monstrous humanity is the foe of all civilized men. It is the eternal enemy of self-preservation, and it is what is at the heart of this situation. And we have to address it, I think, if we're going to have a society that can dispense justice and preserve the lives of those who simply may be on a train one day, and next thing you know, their world's over. It has to change.
Yeah. So I'm curious your take. There are many avenues we could go, but I'll just go to the more direct avenue for time being. And I'm curious your take on this notion of bringing back the asylums. That I haven't studied it myself, but I believe in one case I looked into it, and simply the hospital services were privatized by a Republican governor, which isn't surprising. And I'm curious, to what degree, as a classical liberal, do you think that we ought to support some of these asylums and not allow, like, their former spaces to turn into like a Toyota factory, which I think is what happened in maybe Michigan or Illinois. So it does seem to be a concern, and I think it would be even a bipartisan issue.
I think institutionalization is a very powerful mechanism in society from keeping those that have monstrous humanity from being able to wring destruction upon the rest of them. So I think asylums serve a very core function, and I would support state-funded asylums, 100%.
Right.
Out of my mind. Having said that, I also understand that institutionalization sometimes creates its own category of problems or does not actually
Mhm.
solve the problems it seeks to go out to solve. Doesn't correct behavior, doesn't correct minds, but it's not supposed to. I think institutionalization is a form of isolation and in essence, and
Mhm.
almost a form of punishment. And in the most extreme cases, now some people get institutionalized because they're having just a crisis, but normally they're okay. That's very different. And there are still hospitals out there to help with
Right.
that particular issue. When we talk about asylums, though, we're talking about the criminally insane people who aren't just having a bad day or a bad spell in life. There's something about their mental and cognitive wiring, their moral
Right.
senses polluted, their conscience is messed up. They literally can't function in a way that is not destructive or parasitic, and therefore they need to be addressed. So the asylums exist to correct those people,
Right.
or rather not correct, but to contain those people.
So a limited
Uh,
specific
but
use.
but we can't have a culture that addresses mental health in the general by responding to it with punishment. You have to also respond to it. The vast majority of mental health cases, you have to respond to it with empathy, with sympathy, with charitability, and also with a proactive approach of helping people order their thoughts with what is right for them. And I fear that if we began embracing the asylums as we once did in the 80s and 70s,
Yeah.
and the abuse that came with them, um, we could create a culture of punishment rather than a culture of healing.
Yeah.
And the culture of healing is is the thing that's going to actually treat so many of the pains of mental health problems in society. But as I mentioned, some people don't need healing; they need containment, and that's where the
Yeah.
asylums come into play. So I support it. I
Yeah.
think that any sane civilization that wishes to preserve itself and recognizes the complexities of human nature and recognizes the force it has over how we should make our laws will also seriously consider this. And they will leave behind utopian notions and they'll leave behind notions that are incorrect about man's nature and they will embrace the truth. And embracing the
Yeah.
truth, they will do a good job by themselves, by their citizens, and most importantly, by the aims of veracity, by the truth.
So the second topic related to this would be this leftist ideal of prison abolition. To what degree do you think it's in some ways hysterical to witness the lack of support and then at the same time say, theoretically we should abolish some of the existing systematic services for correction purposes? That's what they're called often, correctional facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, that term corrections, if people study the history of criminal justice in this country, they'll know that the prison, anything that contains you in that way used to be called a penitentiary.
Mhm.
And penitentiary comes from the Latin root word of penance. Penance means to punish. And
Mhm.
so they would say you're going to go to the penitentiary, right? And associated with the idea of the penitentiary are things that are not really sightly, or and they're quite unseemly, like the chain gangs, the kind of prison labor that a lot of people don't like. I have a lot of reservations about, myself included. I have reservations about as well. But that's what the penitentiary is result of. Well, when the shift happened, the shift in our approach to crime and punishment happened.
Mhm.
Um, it became known as corrections because the goal was not to punish you endlessly, it was to correct your behavior, make you a better person in society. It was in essence a nod to character formation, right? Now here's the thing: the law need not be a tool of character formation if the law is properly apportioned to what it's supposed to be addressing, not to issues that it's wandered off into by the virtue of some crusading statesman or
Mhm.
some presumptuous citizen who wishes to see the law brought to bear upon all areas of society without respecting the division between the private sphere and the public sphere, which allows civil society to exist independent of an authoritarian ruler directing its processes. And so, if law is properly functioning, correction shouldn't be necessary on the legal level. It should be not just necessary, but possible and prevalent on the social level. But we've confused the two. And by confusing the two, we've created a system where the system happens to be our tool for moral formation, and that's quite dangerous. because power does not abide what is good for us as people always. Power sometimes abides what is good for its own preservation, which can be what is decidedly bad for us as people. So I say that true corrections will be correcting laws that punish menial crimes that do nothing to cause significant damage to society. We wouldn't need corrections too much if we had that system. You can't, now when someone, goes out and murders somebody or steals things, stuff like that, you have to deal with that in a way that's going to right the wrong, that's going to punish the offense.
Right.
But if someone, is selling drugs or whatever, doing things like that, you're going to have to eventually say the law has gotten too broad in scope and it needs to be narrowed. But on the broader issue of prison abolition, this movement Abolish Prisons, by the way, it's a decidedly socialist movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's a movement that believes that prisons are tools of the ruling class, they're tools of the elites, and whatever word or term is used to conceptualize the ruling class, there are many. The elites, the ruling class, the oligarchy, the intelligentsia, whatever, the Illumina, all that stuff, whatever. Some people have different terms, different words for it. They believe that prisons are the tools of the power class to subjugate lower classes, and that prisons uphold systems that inherently oppress all of us. And that if you abolish prisons, you can then abolish the inherent roots of man's misbehavior, which they believe are incorrect laws and flawed institutions. Again, this is the Rousseauian view that man is born free but is everywhere in chains, that man gets into the earth as a pure creature, the sort of noble savage, but becomes corrupted by the vices of society. Not just law, but also the things that come with society, like luxury, right? Rousseau, On the Origins of Inequality, clearly calls out luxury as a contributor to violent crime or whatever. It's crazy stuff. And of course, he calls luxury as a contributor to poverty. So poverty is inherently about society. It's not about, other things that may precede society, but I digress. And then that's all this is. The Abolish the Prisons movement is the end result of that kind of thinking. And in being the end result of that kind of thinking, it based on flawed premises, is going to produce flawed outcomes. It's going to produce a society where justice is not enforced, where fidelity is deteriorated because fidelity is now being held beneath a certain standard, a standard that is rather skeptical of justice, rather than a standard that is chasing and pursuing and preserving it. You have a lot of bad things that can happen here. So no, I think prison abolition is wrongheaded. It is ill-conceived, and ultimately it has a incorrect view of human nature in most of its manifestations. Mm-hmm. And we have to realize that containment and incorrection are sometimes the only feasible way for a society to correct wrong behavior. But again, as I mentioned, it ought not be the dominant standard. When we get too much into punishing, but not enough into healing, we get a society where behavior is suppressed but not addressed, suppressed but not corrected at the bottom level, at the foundations upon which it sprouts up from. And we can't have that, can we? No sustainable society can have that.
So interestingly, this could help us segue to our next topic, this notion of over-punishment, perhaps, when it comes to the Second Amendment. In the 90s, there were multiple incidences, or perhaps the 80s and the 90s. And this notion that concerned intelligence agencies of militias needed to be monitored. This notion that there was a movement that grows and grows, and that they fundamentally fear the outcomes of it. So the next topic is essentially, to what degree do we think there's an over-punishment of bearers of the Second Amendment, bearers of arms?
Yeah,
and then also they're intertwined too in supporting cases where a judge could say, you're mentally ill, like, sir, you do not, you shouldn't possess this. That's a topic that's always been there, but perhaps it's going to continue to be there more and more.
Yeah, no, these are actually two very important topics. So let me just say this. The Second Amendment, I have never seen the level of attack that it is, ruthless attack, I might say, that it is getting right now in recent times from the right. Not the left. The left always has had a problem with gun ownership. And they've always been trying to compare the American model to the European model wrongly. And they've always been trying to do that. But on the right, ever since the Minneapolis shooting, which was not just unfortunate, it was a tragedy. It was I think really vile, and I think that it really should cause us to focus on how we treat identity in this country and how we talk about it as well. Because certain ways we talk about and treat it can actually lead to wrong conceptions. Wrong conceptions can also lead to bad behavior.
Right.
I just want to understand. But they've used that incident to say we now need to begin restricting guns from trans people or anyone who is mentally ill, so to speak. And my initial reaction to that is not even anything to do with the subjects of the claim. It's more so to do with the principle behind what the claim seeks to assault, which is self-preservation. Principles are meant to be followed, not disregarded at a whim, not broken. And the moment you violate principles for any kind of utility, the moment you say, well, mentally ill people may get the ability to preserve themselves, therefore, and they may use that ability for wrong purposes, therefore we ought to restrict them from preserving themselves, is the moment you've made the principle which enables the existence of human life to continue, which enables the existence of society to continue, you made it optional. You made it optional in the face of what temporary advantages you may accrue from disregarding it. In other words, it's not a principle, it's not a standard. It's a nicety you put there to accrue some kind of agreement, to accrue some kind of oohing and ahhing, but actually to do nothing substantively in reality. The Second Amendment exists because the founders understood what it takes to preserve a society. It's not always pretty. It can't always happen with words and debate. It can't always happen through changing minds. Sometimes force has to stop force. So I'm not comfortable, nor am I going to accept anyone, and I mean anyone, being deprived of their right to own a firearm. Ever. Not going to accept it. The fact that some classes of people, like felons, already are, upsets me enough. So that's one thing.
Can I just play devil's advocate to steelman your argument?
Please. Of course, please.
What if a judge were to prove a violent history? Could that be an exception? If a judge were to say, like, listen, you have a history of violence and domestic abuse, for instance.
Look, some people make mistakes in life. And these situations are so complex, and we have to understand exactly where they come from. So let's say someone does have a history of violence. How old were they when this history of violence happened? Have they demonstrated that they've changed throughout their life? I mean, how do we know this history of violence actually did happen? What are the credibility of the people that's reporting it? There's a lot of factors you have to consider. And in the bureaucratic legal process that our country has, it is very possible that details will slip through the cracks, and they often do slip through the cracks. And in slipping through the cracks, they ultimately lead to things that are not just unjust, but are uncorrectable. So, for example, this is why one of the reasons why I think the death penalty is a terrible idea, in general times. In some cases, I think there's arguments for it, but generally, I just think it's a bad thing. Is because things slip through the cracks. Right? We can't expect the statesman to be this perfect arbiter of knowledge, this enlightened vizier who can organize the city as they did back in ancient Egypt, right? No, the statesman is a human like all of us, limited. Even with the vast amount of resources he can muster up, he is limited in his ability to actually understand things better than anybody else. Because that's more of a matter of perception and intelligence. And perception and intelligence are created and cultivated by a better moral sense, right? By a moral education, a prevalence of moral education. So the judge, I doubt, has the ability or to cover all bases in all situations, right? And facts can change that may lead to us saying, okay, we shouldn't have done that particular thing. So given how complex that topic is, I don't favor banning anybody from owning a gun. I think that you punish the behavior, not the means. If someone has a history of domestic violence, which is abominable, you punish the act of domestic violence.
Right.
If someone has a history of violent outbursts, you punish the violent outbursts. Disorderly conduct exists for a reason, right? You don't punish the means. If someone is so dangerous to society that them having a gun means danger to all of us, that person should be isolated from society. Don't ban their ability to have a gun. Just put them away. If they are that dangerous, very few folks are that dangerous. But if they are that dangerous, they shouldn't even be walking amongst us. Because if it's not a gun they'll use, it's a knife they'll use. If it's not a knife they use, it's a homemade. FBI don't get. I'm not trying to encourage anything FBI. If it's not a knife they use, it's some homemade device that does boom boom things, right? If someone's that dangerous, they need to go.
So,
but the thing is, very few folks are that dangerous because we already have means to correct the kind of person to deal with that kind of thing. We don't have to abridge rights to do that.
Do you think that community, so what do they call them? Community service officers, school security officers, they should be supported further in blue states? Because one of the arguments, I think in Chicago, perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, you know, it may have even been the mayor saying Chicago doesn't have a gun problem. We have a problem of getting guns from red states. Well, maybe the answer to that is, you know, you should have real security rather than like, you know, low level security officers that you guys thought up in theory, but that rarely work in our present society.
Yeah. So actually, let's kind of address this argument because for a very long time, Democratic and progressive figures have been saying, and this is a really peculiar argument, we banned the guns in our states, so our laws are working, but it's the gun trade from other states coming in that is actually making our laws not work. Therefore, we have to ban guns in the red states too in order to make sure that we're not dealing with these problems. Well, okay, it's very peculiar because the reverse might actually be true, might it not? Because the mere act of making something criminal creates a undermarket, a black market for that thing. And in the case of certain kinds of things like guns or poisons, toxins, drugs, it creates not just a black market, but it creates a trade.
Right.
It creates a trade. And that trade is monopolized by criminal organizations by necessity. And criminal organizations operate in a shadowy underworld that eludes the detection of the authorities.
Right.
So, wouldn't it actually stand to reason that it could just as likely be blamed on the presence of prohibition rather than the absence of prohibition for the proliferation of guns in blue states? Right. I think it absolutely can be. That's just one point that has to be made. The second point that should probably be made about this issue is that it seems as if they have enough information to pick out the source of the problem, but I don't see any organized task force going ahead to tackle the gun trade in any substantive way that is reducing crimes in blue states. We do have an agency in the government, the ATF, which shouldn't exist, that does tackle the gun trade and sometimes partakes in the gun trade itself. That's a different story for a different day. And why haven't they been called in to actually address this ominous gun trade problem in blue states? The problem they haven't been called in is because it's actually not the whole truth. The truth is that an undermarket, an underground market is going to have more capability and more accessibility to get these things than a legal gun trade could ever do. Right. So I think the problem is it's a speculative hypothesis.
Right. And isn't it ironic? Yeah, go ahead. Go Sorry, cut off.
Go on. No, you're good. Go on.
Okay. I think it was just an audio delay. And isn't it interesting that Luigi Mangione, if I'm not mistaken, used a ghost gun? In New York City, it has a ghost gun crisis. So all the young people supporting Luigi Mangione and maybe some even older folks, they're ironically supporting such a libertarian style, such a classical liberal style notion of, yeah, we'll ghost gun it. So it's interesting that almost like they're anti-guns until it gets used by the person whose motives they agree with, and who any objective viewer sees it as murder, but they've somehow rationalized past two things: murder and the very laws that the escape of the laws that they support.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
So that, by the way, this is exactly what Marxists do.
Right.
People like to think it's an own if you say to a Marxist, you're rich, you benefit from capitalism. Bernie Sanders wrote a book. Bernie Sanders has a mansion. He's a hypocrite. And I just look at those people saying, are you kidding me? Are you this damned ignorant, and excuse some of my viewers who don't like cursing, but I have to, sometimes a curse word is the only word that actually describes the visceral reaction that I have to a situation. Are you this damned ignorant that you can't see that this person is actually perfectly in line with their principles because they are using the system to destroy the system? And to them, as long as they are not perpetuating the system in their mind, they're scot-free. They're in the clear. If you spend more time angry at a socialist for having a mansion than trying to see how the socialist is using their mansion, using their resources to further the destruction of capitalism and a good society and a free society, then you are enabling the socialist to win. Because you're doing exactly what they want you to do. You're being distracted by spectacle and turned off by substance. Because substance is not sexy. It's not as sexy as, people talk about, what is it, Bonnie Blue, this lady in England that slept with 200 people, or people talking about, Jews or whatever, people talking about whatever, trans. Substance, things that actually matter, are not as appealing because they're not as flashy, but they are more important than you can ever imagine. So I really don't think we've postured ourselves to fight socialism the best way, because we think hypocrisy is the main argument. But if hypocrisy is your argument, then you've lost the political and moral debate before it's even started. Because I can still be a hypocrite, which means I don't adhere to my personal standards and still have sound behavior. People don't realize that. Right? If someone says, hey, don't smoke while lighting up a cigarette, they're being a hypocrite, but they're actually telling something that's actually good for you. Don't smoke. It'll give you cancer. It'll degrade your liver. It'll mess you up. It'll kill you. Give you a breathing problem later on in life. Could possibly burn a hole in your esophagus. Like, don't do that. Right? Even though they're being a hypocrite, you ought to listen to that hypocrite. He's actually giving you a lot of advice. Don't smoke, even though he's lighting up a cigarette. How they do it. So I don't know. I just think that the left is more consistent than people think they are. Luigi was a revolutionary in their mind.
Right.
He was a revolutionary in their mind. He did something that, in their view, caused the pain of everyone ever burned by the medical system to be felt and heard across the world. So we'll ignore the fact that he literally had that manufactured weapon, which really regulations, it'll lose regulations, and killed somebody because it was used as a tool for the greater good, right?
Right.
That's the theory.
And they're hoping, a lot of them, as supporters, of course, they're hoping for repeats, things like that. They are so far in this hatred of American marketplace, American capitalism, that they've had enough. If they see another Luigi figure, they would endorse and not condemn.
Totally, and it's a shame. And I think that it speaks to the danger of the power worldview. And I've mentioned that when you interpret society through power and institutions and systems, I think that you have the tendency to reduce values that enable society to go smooth. You have the tendency to reduce the humanity of those you interact with. And by reducing the humanity of those you interact with, you no longer think like a moral agent. You think like you think like an opportunist agent. You think as someone who is guided by utility and who's guided by a narrow-minded imposition of their ideology upon the world, rather than someone guided by the observable facts of life. What life requires, our duties as people, right? First principles for duty bound by first principles. And the only way you actually ensure a sustainable society is by that character formation that happens through that deeper conception. I cut myself off. The deeper conception. That's the only way you actually ensure it. So there's a question in the chat I want to answer. And I know there's some more comments in the chat that I have not looked at quite yet, but I'm going to get to them in a second. But Bud asks, so Hassan Piker living in luxury, but is advocating for socialism is not hypocritical. No, it's not. Not in the slightest. Because Hassan Piker, well, first of all, okay, we've got to get better foils we've got to get better foils for our critiques. I don't think somebody who is famous because of his uncle's work and also has built himself up to be more visually interesting than he is intellectually interesting, I don't think that person is the best standard of measurement when trying to address the problems of socialism. I really, 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 really don't. I would much rather people go back and study the Fabians in England, because a lot of socialists today in Western society are very Fabian. They're very glacial, slow.
Explain
They're
that
very,
for us.
yeah, exactly. They tend to actually want to work in the system rather than try to destroy the system. Some socialists do want to destroy the system, but a lot of effective ones want to work in the system. Bernie Sanders is a Fabian. He's one
I
of the
see.
most influential socialists in the whole country. Sorry, Nikoji. Go on.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain Fabians. Like,
Yeah, so the Fabians
quick
were a part of the
rundown,
Fabian
crash course.
Society. They were a group of socialists in England, and they were characterized by their contrast with the revolutionary socialists. The Fabians were the intellectuals, the academics, the people that actually benefited from the system and wanted to change the system towards socialism in a very glacial way. Whereas the revolutionaries wanted to just go into the system, blow it up from the inside, and impose a different system. So the difference between a Fabian and a revolutionary is different between somebody like Lenin, and somebody like, say, Mamdani, right? Different figures that are years apart, decades apart rather, but still, they operate in a similar tradition. Lenin was the one that actually wanted to go in and destroy the Tsar, destroy Imperial Russia, and impose communism upon society. Mamdani wants to go in and use the system to reinforce socialism within the system. So that is what a Fabian is, and actually, most people only understand them on a social surface level. I might actually do a video doing a deep dive into the Fabians, because I think if you want to understand socialism in the modern day, you have to understand how it operates in that register. But back to Bud's question. So no, he's not being hypocritical, I don't think, because if he really is a socialist, and I don't know if he is or not, I don't really trust anything he says, to be frank with you. He seems to be a swindler and a rogue, right? He seems to traffic in dishonesty. And so I don't really think I can trust anything he says. But assuming he is a socialist, then he can easily justify it with his principles by saying, hey, luxury is a tool to destroy the bourgeoisie. Therefore, I'm not doing anything bad by temporarily dwelling amongst them in the profit margin area. So, but I really think we got to get better foils for socialists in our modern society, because people like Hassan Piker and these social media people, they're not even in the top 1% or the top 10 or top 20 of the most authentic or difficult socialists that we reckon with. Like, go back through history and read about some of the socialist thinkers that actually impacted their world, rather than these people that just talk and engage in spectacle and do all this nonsense. For what? For what? Because they know we're going to actually pay them through our attention and through our efforts. It's just silly. I don't. Slavoj Zizek, right? If I'm going to look at a socialist in modern day, I would rather look at somebody like him, because you can actually understand that he believes what he's saying, and he has a very sophisticated worldview, even though he's wrong about a lot of things, right? I don't go to Hassan Piker. That's just me. So maybe I'm crazy though. Who knows? And to kind of carry on to this point, I think that social media has made the performance of political ideologies like socialism very fashionable. And so here's what I do. Whenever I see somebody align with the camp, whether they call themselves a conservative or socialist, I ask myself one single question. I say, okay, how deeply does this person understand what they're claiming to be? And you can understand how deeply they understand it by measuring their words and arguments against the historical record, against what the best advocates for that ideology, have decided to believe. That's how you understand it. So I just really have a hard time taking Hassan Piker seriously. When you know about people like Eugene V. Debs and William the guy who did the Cross of Gold speech, and people like that, you tend not to, and Slavoj Zizek, you tend not to deal with the lower emanations. You tend to stay right there.
Christian, I think I'm going to have to hop off. I felt a little ill and
That's totally fine. Totally fine.
took
I'm
my
going to continue on a
temperature.
little bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to continue on a little
So
bit.
I'm
Thank you
going
for joining us.
to just rest and
Yeah.
recover, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no,
And
thank you
to
for
all the
joining us,
viewers.
Nikoji, and
Mhm.
we'll see you later. I'm going to
I'll be
continue on.
back when I'm better rested and maybe get rid of this fever. So until then, stay
Absolutely.
offensive. Take care, guys.
All right. Get well, my friend. All right. So, just me, guys. So, as I was mentioning, actually, let me respond to this comment. Fascism is on the rise in Europe, AfD party in Germany. So, I'm curious, why do you think the AfD is fascist? I'm actually very curious to know that. I haven't seen anything remotely fascist about them, to be frank with you. And by the way, I'm somebody that has studied the doctrine of fascism by Giovanni in Chile. I've studied Evola. I've studied a lot of these different thinkers that actually formed what fascism came to mean in the 30s. And I don't see any of that in the AfD. What I do see in the AfD is I see a very strong desire to preserve their culture. I see a very strong desire to beat back the kind of erosion that comes from universal benevolence over a duty and fidelity to your people. I see a lot of different things in the AfD, but fascism is not one of those. So I'd be very interested and very curious in seeing as to why you believe they are fascist, because I don't necessarily think that's the case. And I'd also be interested in seeing what your definition of fascism is, because a lot of people, don't understand that term. AfD party went to Holocaust Museum, did such. So, did certain members of the party do that, or did the leadership do that? I mean, so here's the thing: you can't use the performance of a particular person in a organization to be the whole sentiment of the people in that organization. You just can't. You can't do it. This is called proximity ethics. It's called proximity ethics. So, as far as I understand, there's also a transgressive element that exists with that as well. But as far as I understand, the AfD is not advocating for anything remotely close to Nazism. The AfD is advocating for cultural preservation. So I don't know what more to say. What I do think is, I think Nazism was an evil ideology. I think that it is one of the darker parts of Germany's past. But I don't see anything remotely in the AfD's platform that would suggest that they are wholesale continuations of Nazism. I just don't see it. So you'll have to kind of go more into that for me. I don't know. She may be. I don't know. But I think most importantly, what the AfD is doing, and by the way, look, speaking of political power and feasibility, the AfD's members are dropping like hotcakes. Like, they are really just being decimated by whatever force, who knows, but they're being decimated. And unfortunately, this is going to impact their electoral viability. And unfortunately, it's going to also probably stymie any substantive political influence they're going to have in the future. So what do you do? What do you do? You have to really ask yourself the question: if it was the AfD has been smeared enough in Germany. If it was so easy just to connect them with a past that the vast majority of Germans not only hate, but they have made it illegal to even have a statue or even have anything to do with that Nazism, then they would just do that. Why are all these people dropping like hotcakes? Because there is a much deeper phenomenon at play here that cannot just be reduced to Nazism. Yeah, so I don't accept this idea that they're fascists. I doubt it. I think they care about their culture, and that's fundamentally a good thing. And I think that the lie of cultural progressivism is that all cultures can be reconciled if the terms are adjusted in a certain way. But in all reality, the terms can never be adjusted in a certain way without giving ruination to somebody else. The only way the terms can be set for a flourishing culture to happen is for the terms to be equal and the terms to be uniform. If you lack uniformity and you lack equality, you will never have a culture that can be preserved. You will simply have a culture that is going to be fighting for its survival against the numerous fracturing fissures that is forming in its foundations. That's why in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's a statement of uniformity, a philosophical uniformity. Not some of us hold these truths to be self-evident. Some of us believe in equality. Some of us believe that human nature has a certain... No. It was a statement of uniformity. And uniformity does not mean sameness. Uniformity means similar orderedness. Sameness is when you reduce all differentiation to one standard and just eliminate any variation. But even the most uniform thing can have variation. Think that a uniform you would wear for work. Well, all parts of the uniform are going to look different, even though it has a certain orderliness about it. So you must have uniformity and equality in order to have a good culture, in order to have a preserved culture. And the sooner we recognize this in the West, the better. The better. So I'm going to let you guys ask some more questions. Since Nikoji is not here, I'm going to be respectful of him. Although, because as you guys know, I could go on for a long time, but I won't do that. I'm going to be respectful of him, and I'm actually going to hop off, and I'm going to edit tonight's video, which is about the tyranny of the moment, society's new slave master, which I think you guys will enjoy. It's a very interesting video. I'm actually very proud of it myself. And it's going to continue. It's going to be the first in a set of videos that I do over the next 2 days, where I'm just going to be really hard just pushing content out, because we have a message that needs to be heard. We have a voice that needs to be heard. And I really believe that we're on the cusp of something. I do believe it, even though, right now we are going through a lot of different growing pains as in this channel. We're on the cusp of something very special. So I believe it, and I really hope all of you are moved by that notion as well. But yeah, I will be ending this very shortly here. But just ask some more questions if you want, so that we can at least hit an hour. When we hit an hour, I'm gone. So that's about 8 minutes. So ask some more questions if you wish. I'm here to listen. Bobby says, I want immigrants, definitely illegal and some legal possible. I mean, just beyond the utilitarian point. That's the utilitarian point. I'm not saying it's a bad point, but that's the utilitarian point. Because what if we did need more people? Does that then make your culture? Does that then make your culture negotiable? No. No amount of need can make your culture negotiable. Your culture and the people within it, as a statesman, as a citizen, is where your fidelity lies. The moment one says it's negotiable because we have some need is the moment you get cultural coercion. And that cannot happen. That is not a good thing. That actually deteriorates the country while attempting to help it in this particular case. Bringing in people because your culture needs it, or you might need it economically. Economics has a moral dimension to it. It has to be adhered to. And Cicero actually talks about this a lot in De Officiis, on obligation. But economics begins with the idea that money is spent, and money is spent in certain ways, and there are certain avenues and there are certain pathways that money can go down. That's the economics. The morals say, how should we spend money? How do we bind prudence and our spending habits to and do rightful conduct? How do we combine kindness in our spending habits? That's the moral dimension. And we really have to apply that same dimension to the question of immigration and economics as well, I think. That's why I say I'm an immigration restrictionist. There's a lot of different avenues of that. What is your favorite fact about Grotius? Grotius. So my favorite fact about him is the fact that he was locked in jail, put in prison for writing things that were not popular or not fashionable. And when he was put in prison, he finished his best best work, which is On Law of War and Peace, De Jure Ac Pacis, which is where his famous preliminary discourse comes from, which is where the famous phrase that he said about God, morality being persistent even in the face of not having any divine. That's where all that comes from. He wrote that while imprisoned. And he escaped prison, I think, through a chest. Like he smuggled himself to a chest with all his papers and escaped prison through it. That's my favorite fact about it. That is made for TV. It's awesome. And I think that kind of courage really lends credibility to the words you speak. Because Grotius's life was on the line for the words he spoke and the things he believed. And courage really only has effect when it is on line with those kind of things. So that's my perspective. I think Grotius was an awesome guy. And I think that he's an example for many of us to model in our own lives. I'm not saying go to jail. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying don't allow consequences to deter you from what is right and true. In fact, if you allow consequences to impact your decision-making in that moral regard, allow them to do so towards a desire to correct the protection that is sometimes given to things that are unjust and false. Morality ought to be as much of a fire as it is as an instruction. I'll say it again. Morality ought to be as much of a fire within your heart as it is an instruction. Because I can be taught things all day long. But if I have no sentiment behind that, it'll simply be a rote activity I perform. That's why when people have jobs they hate, they don't give it their all. Because there's no fire, there's no passion, there's no conviction. It's just a rote, I gotta go to work because I gotta go pay my bills. I gotta go do this. That's where all the complaining comes from. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that's how it happens. But when you have a fire behind you in your actions, the only thing that can stop your actions is the dimming of that fire. And that's the only person that can really have an effect on that is you and your thought process. Nothing else is going to be needed to sustain you in the pursuit of the correct thing. So morality requires fire. Without fire, it just doesn't have the effect it needs to have. And Grotius had fire. Cicero had fire. Keynes had fire. Reid had fire. The great Germaine de Stael, one of my favorite female philosophers, she had fire, enough fire to call out Napoleon while he was still in power. She called out Napoleon Bonaparte while he was still in power. The literal dictator of dictators had no problem saying, this guy is a tyrant, this guy is disordered, this guy has a lot of problems, has the characteristics of a disordered man. And that's where his tyranny comes from. They have fire backing it. So that's what I really think we have to work on cultivating. That sense of fire within ourselves. Just don't let the fire burn you out, because the fire can burn bright and high, and then it can just burn out. It can fizzle out and become a set of embers. And it's just waiting to go away. Or a fire can become the beginning of something that you never even considered could happen. The beginning of a different possibility. The beginning of your refinement. Steel is refined in fire. So, yeah. That's my thinking on that topic. All right, guys, we've got about 2 more minutes. Ask any questions you want to ask. I hope all of you are having a good week, by the way. I hope all of you had a good weekend, rather. We're about to go into a new week, which is going to be interesting, right? So, but by the way, there's going to be a lot more content, guys. A lot more content. Like a crap ton. Like, just get ready. Get yourself ready. There's going to be a lot more content in the next few days. Because we have an operation to sustain. We had a cohort to build, a country to help change, or rather to preserve. We've got a lot of minds to inspire. So I'm going to work in overtime to make sure we can do that. And I'm going to ask you guys to also work in overtime, or not work in overtime, but just to work a little bit to help me get the message out there. Not in overtime. Don't do what I'm doing, right? Because obviously this is my project, right? But still, I need your help. So with your help, I believe we're actually going to change things. We're actually going to be able to do something that's important that is substantive, and I'm very excited for that moment, because right now there's a lot of nonsense and a lot of noise, a lot of chaos floating in the air, and we need to break through. Right? We need to break containment, as they say, because we are in containment right now. So we need to break that. And when we do, I believe our message is going to be most inspiring and most enlightening, and it's going to be most, I think, fruitful, most nourishing. So we're in the last few seconds here, my friends. Thank you guys so much for being here. Again, look out for tonight's video. It's going to be coming in the next hour or so. It's going to be a very important topic. The moment it goes up, like it, share it, comment, no matter what, just please do it. The algorithm loves that. My friends, thank you guys so much for being here. As always, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please, my friends, forever and eternally, stay pensive. Bye, guys.